Well, just as relations between South Africa and the United States seem to be easing, President Trump's nominee for ambassador to Pretoria, Brent Bozell, stirred tensions again, this time during his appearance before the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Well, we joined in the studio by Ryan Smith, the Democratic Alliance spokesperson on international relations, to get the DA's take on Mr. Bozell's remarks and what they could mean for the relationship going forward. Well, hi, Ryan. Good to see you again.
Hi, Linda. Thanks very much for having me.
So what's your take on Mr. Bozell, President Trump's pick for ambassador, and what he said in front of the committee?
Yes, well, look, he's still an ambassador nominee. We know that he presented his credentials to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I think it was on the 23rd of October. And the process will now unfold for him to be formally selected, for his accreditations to come through, from the White House to South Africa, etc., and for those to be accepted. So it's not quite yet a done deal, but I think that his submission in that committee and what he put forward as a potential candidate was very interesting. Certainly, as to be expected from a representative of the Trump administration, and that's quite normal for the US. Obviously, ambassadors are linked to the term of a particular president, so that's quite normal. And certainly what we've seen, the White House and Washington's concerns with South Africa have also been echoed in his statement as well. So he had three main focal areas. The first, obviously, was trade. South Africa remains one of the US's largest trading partners and vice versa. There are over 500 companies in South Africa, or American companies invested in South Africa that create hundreds of thousands of jobs. And certainly the US is very reliant on South African agricultural exports. And automotive exports, certainly through the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So the trade relationship, first and foremost, is what needs to be secured. And we know that there's been good movement on the trade talks thus far. The second focal point was on what the US refers to as geopolitical shifts and strategic geopolitical sort of changes from South Africa. There, I think that there definitely is some agreement from the DA's side. By definition, our foreign policy is supposed to be non-aligned. Now, non-alignment doesn't mean neutral. It means not picking sides, in the sense that we don't align ourselves with any one particular global superpower, so to say. We look at it as an open opportunity approach to things like economic diplomacy and general diplomacy. And South Africa, or the South African government under the ANC, has definitely not been non-aligned. We see that they're cozying up to Russia and Iran, and that the ANC's party political international alliances have permeated through into South African foreign policy, which is a real problem. And it's not just a problem for the US, obviously, in terms of their security as a nation. It is a violation of South Africa's constitutional principles. Our constitution exists to protect and promote freedom, human rights, democracy, the rule of law. We cannot, by definition, be aligning ourselves with a country like Russia and Iran, where those principles do not exist and are actually actively trampled upon. And then the third focal point that we've seen was around, I'm just trying to remember now.
Afrikaners.
Yes, it was on land expropriation more broadly, with a slight reference to Afrikaner and what they refer to as minority rights. That will be an interesting one because the Land Expropriation Act, the DA has a very, very strong court case against that piece of legislation as it stands. And we are hoping for a positive judgment on that particular piece of legislation so that it can be sent back to Parliament to be properly and procedurally reworked. Remember, that was pushed through when the ANC still held a majority in the previous term. If it comes back to Parliament, that majority under the ANC no longer exists. And so there's room now for us to properly panel beat that piece of legislation to be in line with the Constitution and to ultimately protect private property rights, which is what the US's big concern is. And then in regards to the sort of minority grouping issues in South Africa, they're referring to the US's belief that there's a genocide against white Afrikaners. And I think that what will be very important for whoever the ambassador is from the US is to actually come to South Africa and see for yourself what really is happening on the ground. I think that Minister Steenhuisen from the DA said it quite correctly when he was in the White House with President Trump, that yes, there is definitely a rural safety problem in South Africa, and that farmers, not just white farmers, but farmers in general, are being persecuted. I think that there is evidence to motivate for there being a hate crime against white farmers in particular. And it certainly is a certain type of crime that requires a certain type of response from the South African police service. But if you look at South Africa's crime stats, white South Africans are not disproportionately affected by crime in relation to other racial groups. So calling it a particular sort of attack on one race group, I think is incorrect. But as I said, we hope that Ambassador nominee Bozell will come and see for himself. And I think that through his engagements with not only the South African government, but interested civil society organizations and stakeholders, he will come to see that the truth, I think, around that particular issue.
Do you think there's any chance South Africa could say no to this appointment, especially given what he said about the ICJ case against Israel? Could Pretoria send a message to Washington that this nominee is just not acceptable for them?
Well, look, the relationship remains fractious, and I think there are many pressure points for the US that South Africa will have to deal with when the ambassador is sent through. And I think that those particular pressure points have already been well discussed and well kind of fleshed out through the trade talks since the tariffs have been placed upon South Africa. So I think those conversations are already underway, and the necessary diplomatic channels have been established, and South Africa must follow due course to sort those out. There must be, I think, we need to, obviously, as with any diplomatic relationship, there must be a form of mutual respect, in the same way that South Africa's ambassador to Washington should not be allowed to openly criticize and insult the US administration in the same way that Ibrahim Rasool did. So we believe that the Americans must have the same approach when coming to South Africa. We understand that the US has concerns, but we are open to engage with those. And I mean, I'm speaking here from the DA's perspective, obviously not from the government side, but I think it's crucial that we engage earnestly and honestly on these topics, and come to some sort of agreement or some sort of understanding. We've seen that when President Trump himself goes in with negotiations, he's just come out of negotiations with Xi Jinping in China, and those talks we thought were going to be particularly, fraught and filled with tension. But ultimately, there is a way forward, I think, for nations to find common ground, and we hope that the same will be true for South Africa.
Well, an area where you seem to have common ground with the US is on BEE, because the Democratic Alliance is also taking a strong stance against BEE, and so is the US. So is this a point of alignment?
Yes, absolutely. But I think we need to draw a very strong sort of differentiator between what the US's issue is with BEE and what the DA's issue is with BEE. I think the US has approached it from the perspective of it being a policy that oppresses certain minority groupings in South Africa, like white South Africans, and that obviously plays into the greater narrative of what the US is concerned with in South Africa. The DA has been fighting BEE long before the United States became aware of it. We've had a problem with this policy for I would say, decades now. And it has reached a point where there is broad consensus across political parties that economic redress is absolutely crucial to get South Africans out of poverty. What the DA is saying is that BEE as a law to be an antidote to that problem is not working. And it's not a personal opinion. It's not something that we've thumb-sucked. The evidence is there. If you look at the way in which racial metrics have been used for empowerment through BEE policies, all it's done is facilitate corruption. It's re-enriched the same people who are connected right at the top of the ANC's political circles, and it's made South Africans poorer, and given them less access to economic redress and opportunity. All we're saying as the DA is that we both want the same thing, but your policy doesn't work, and it's been proven not to work. We have an alternative, and instead of focusing on race, we're focusing on poverty. Because if you remove race from the equation, it means that you can be empowered, but not re-empowered again based on nothing other than the color of your skin. And it really focuses redress where it is needed, which is on poor South Africans of all racial groups, quite frankly, who are desperately in need of it. And just to finish off, I think that look, I know that the US has an issue with BEE, but it's really something that South Africans can deal with on our own. I think the tide is turning against that policy. Many South Africans across racial lines are seeing that it's not worked. We are moving into a space where South Africans are looking more evidence-based at policy and delivery from political parties as opposed to just ideology and slogan. And I think it's something that I know the US is concerned with, but we as a country can certainly deal with on our own. And there is very good movements on that particular issue.
Have you heard anything from the government on what is happening with those trade talks? They say it's going well, but is there any chance of a breakthrough that you know about?
No, look, it's very difficult because the US themselves have asked for all of their trade negotiations to take place under non-disclosure agreements. And so there's very little information that you can get out. I know that South Africa has put forward a very, very competitive deal from the information available to us publicly. We know that obviously South Africa, in terms of US interests, is very strategic in terms of trade. If you look at precious metals, raw materials, agricultural exports, certainly to offset the seasonality issue between the northern and southern hemisphere. And other industries such as the automotive industry are very, very crucial for the US. But we know that the trade talks are progressing very nicely. We know that there's good movement there. But it is going to take, I think, a little bit more time. What would help, and this is where the South African government is still on the back foot, is the appointment of our ambassador to the US. We need to open up those channels formally. We need to have a credible voice in Washington to champion South Africa's issues. And I think the last I heard was that the Ramaphosa was looking at appointing Dr. Alistair Ruiters, who's his strategic advisor for the economy and investments in the presidency, which on paper I think would be a good appointment. He's got a lot of trade experience, which is crucial for this particular relationship, and I think is relatively unscathed in terms of his political statements in the past, which is important for this relationship in particular.
So what I gather from what you've said, you want to ask Ambassador-designate Bozell to come and see for himself in South Africa, and it may change some of its perspectives.
Yes, absolutely. And that's true for any ambassadorial posting or diplomatic posting. You only really get a feel of a country or a feel of the socioeconomic issues, for example, when you live in that country and when you speak to ordinary South Africans on a day-to-day basis. And I think that what's happened in the US is not that they've been misinformed, but they've only gotten one side of the story. And I think that coming here, whoever the ambassador is to South Africa, when they do arrive and when they can start to get a holistic and comprehensive understanding of South Africa, it will be much better for that relationship going forward because there'll be greater understanding. And I think a better platform upon which those talks and that diplomatic relationship can be restored. And we certainly are looking forward to meeting Ambassador nominee Bozell, if he is the ambassador who's sent through here to Pretoria. And we hope that South Africa sends a competent career diplomat through to Washington and not someone who's mired in the really unuseful, I would say, sort of party political rhetoric of the ANC, because it just doesn't serve our foreign service at all.
I see that Durka has not responded to Bozell's comments. It seems they are treading carefully not to upset the Trump administration again.
I think they are, but I do think that the ANC, if you look at what they've recently said about our challenges as the DA to certain, as I refer to, pressure points between the US and South Africa, even the ANC is starting to come around and say, look, we obviously see things differently from a policy perspective, but maybe what the DA is saying has some merit. And there's a slow, I would say, change of, maybe not change of heart, but there's a slow recognition of policy change to really address South Africa's biggest problem, which is poverty and unemployment. And we know that the president has recently admitted that the Expropriation Act isn't perfect and that there could actually be problems with that particular piece of legislation that need to be reworked. And even on the BEE front, we know that some senior leaders in the ANC have said, well, maybe instead of just dismissing the DA's proposal for a counter policy to BEE, we should sit and look at ways in which this policy maybe needs to be reformed. So like I was saying earlier, that process of South Africa fixing its own problems is already underway. It's not really customary for another nation to come in and want to change our own domestic policy. You would never go to another country and say, we'll only do X if you change your laws. What's the point of having a democracy and voting for parties and governments in that case, if it all boils down to what another country outside of your country has to say? So yeah, it's a very, very interesting time. And ultimately what the South African government needs to realize is that our domestic policy is not in alignment with our international objectives. You can't say that we want to focus on economic diplomacy, growing the economy, attracting foreign direct investment, when you've got domestic policies such as BEE, such as employment equity, such as the minimum wage or a very restrictive labor regime, which are counterintuitive to what you want to achieve in terms of your economic objectives. So I think this process of reforming and realigning domestic policy to our international objectives is the most crucial thing that South Africa can do now. And I think all South Africans need to get behind that. Policy is not, you can't look at a law and look at the title or look at its intent and say that it's a good policy. You need to look at what it can achieve. BEE was supposed to uplift Black South Africans out of poverty. It was supposed to give them a leg up. It has not done that. So you have to, by virtue of an honest, data-driven assessment, say this policy doesn't work. We still need to address the problem, but let's look at a different avenue to achieve it.
Ryan Smith from the DA, thank you so much.
Thank you.